it's been really healing to the degree that I can talk about all that scary stuff that was living in me that had shame attached to it, or fear or sadness or grief. And I can just talk about it in a different way because it was the healing ointment, that God gave me, and just said, just give it time, Susan. I'm going to bring something wonderful to you.
Welcome to the Extraordinary Lives podcast, where we talk about lives that go beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary, with the extra being Jesus. We'll be encouraged with amazing stories and helpful insights from the lives of ordinary people who have that extra, that supernatural difference that only Jesus can give. I'm your host, Ellen Bennett. Thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I am thrilled to have Susan Salluce with me today. She is a life coach and also a grief specialist. Thank you so much for being here, Susan. I know you'll have so many wonderful things to share that will help all of us.
Oh, thanks, Ellen. It's really nice to talk with you today, too.
Good. I wanted to go ahead and open with a little bit about you. What are you up to these days? And just tell us a little bit about your family.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So what am I up to these days? Well, my husband and I are living in Carlsbad. We've lived here almost 3 years now. I have adult children that are living in the area. I have a son who's 28 and a daughter who's 25.
Great.
And she's married and my son's engaged. So it's a happy time for our family. And yeah, I've been life coaching now / counseling for the past 2 years, doing that remotely and then a little bit in person, but mostly remotely with people actually all over the world, which is exciting.
That is.
And getting to use the skills I acquired as a therapist back in the day, and then with my grief specialty and some spiritual direction too.
That's terrific. Well, great. Well, I know you have a really special story to share with us today about an extraordinary way you saw God at work in your life that just has his fingerprints all over it. So let's go ahead and jump in and start with that.
Sure. I was thinking about how to bring it up to speed. I guess the easiest way is to say that I'm adopted, and I know I've been adopted. My whole life I've known. I grew up being told that I was special, that I was chosen, and I think my family, who, when I refer to my family, they'll be the people who raised me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I refer to my birth family, I'll refer to them as my birth family, just for clarity.
Sure.
But my family was really good about making me feel like I was chosen and special. And while I appreciated that, there was always a sense of something's not right, because I was brought into a home where there was a lot of violence and a lot of grief and a lot of confusion and a lot of anger. And so consequently, I spent lots and lots of time with my grandparents and was kind of raised by them. And that's where I was introduced to Jesus. And that was really, I kind of lived in an old people's world. It was very sweet. I hung out with them and their friends. I went to church. We did Sunday drives. It was a really slow paced, sweet life when I was with them.
Okay, yes.
And I would watch my grandmother read the Bible every night. But again, there were so many paradoxes of hearing that God was a God of grace and love. And yet, when I'd be sent back home, that was not particularly what I felt. I felt confusion. And how could there be a God of love and grace if there's all this mayhem in my family? So, I was walking with the Lord a number of years, fell away in my later teen years, and then came back in college through college ministry, which I later did too, as an adult in Santa Cruz. And this time around, my faith took on a more personal tone, less legalistic of my childhood, less God's just sort of this figure in the sky, but kind of waiting for me to do wrong things, and I better be nice and not naughty. And it took shape of what do I want it to look like for my life? And at this time, my family was rapidly deteriorating and would go on to really fall apart in a big way. And so after my mother died when I was 26, I began to have these stirrings of who am I and where do I come from? And, I had done a lot of counseling. I'd gotten my counseling degree by then and was counseling others and having lots of questions about what shapes personality and what shapes spirituality and who am I? So I hired a private investigator and was able to find my birth mom pretty quickly. It was
Wow.
pre-internet,
Mm-hmm.
and that didn't go so well. I was able to find her and wrote her a letter, and I received a letter back that was very harsh about, kind of how dare you disrupt my life. And that was pretty crushing.
Yeah.
I understood that was probably a terribly hard decision for her to give a child up. I had enough maturity in me to understand that, but her reaction was pretty severe. And I just
Mm-hmm.
had a baby, so
Wow.
yeah, it was a little double whammy. But a year later, she wrote back and really apologized and said, "Hey, I was just in shock. I was in a bad place." Okay. And fast forward that story, we met and we talked, and I came out of that whole experience knowing that it was the best thing that she gave me up for adoption.
Wow. Huh.
Yeah, that she was not a loving person. She had given up several children. I was able to meet her, spent time with her, but in the end, I couldn't integrate her into our life, and especially the life of my family.
Mm-hmm.
By then, I'd had a second child, and I was becoming more protective. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
who do I want in my children's lives?
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of put that to bed, like, I'm not going to open up this box anymore. Too much hurt. So then fast forward to about 2015 or 16. And I have one child at college, and I'm no longer doing therapy. I actually transitioned to becoming a writer and published a couple of books and
Mm-hmm.
was really exploring themes of grace and addiction and burnout in the professional field of psychology. And I got a package in the mail one day telling me that my birth mom had died. And it was from an attorney, one of these terrible attorneys, sort of fishing if, do I
Mm-hmm.
want to sue because she didn't include me in the will,
Oh boy.
But it listed all these people that I was biologically related to.
Ah.
And all of a sudden, I had questions again. Should I open the door?
Mm-hmm.
And I sat with
Wow.
that for a little while, and I sat with it for about a year.
Okay.
And then one day decided to open it, and that became another can of worms where I learned that my birth father and my birth brother were both, criminals and had done some horrible things and hurt people in some really
Mm.
profound ways. And I would say I was in the peak of like my just being so in love with Jesus. I was doing full-time college ministry. Now both kids are away from school. My house is filled with all these college students. And I just sat with God thinking, how can this be possible? How do I reconcile all this loss?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like maybe you put this desire in my heart, God, but it's too painful to look at.
Yeah.
So I went to counseling. I saw this wonderful Christian therapist, and I said, I just have to pour my heart out because I feel somehow dirty, like
Hmm.
soiled, like sins of the father kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And even though intellectually and theologically, I knew that wasn't true, there was a
Right.
part of me that was really wrestling with that, and I was really haunted. And so I told him my whole story, and it was very exhausting. I just wept, and he said, this is why Christ died on the cross, Susan.
Mm. Wow.
There's no contamination on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that, but I couldn't talk about it. So if people
Uh-huh.
said, oh, you're adopted? Oh, do you know your birth family? Which I always think is just such an amazing, odd question to jump into somebody who's been adopted.
Mm-hmm.
My answer would be, yes, I'm adopted. Yes, I found them, and I don't talk about that, which is really
Mm.
strange because I'm sort of an open book. I'll talk about anything in
Yeah.
my life. But I was still too hurt. So again, jumping forward again to about 2018, I always wanted to know what nationality I was. It was 23andMe. Everybody was doing their
Yes.
DNA tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my husband had done his, and he said, why don't you do one? Wouldn't this be exciting for you? And a part of me was like, yes, it could be very exciting. And also, I don't know if I want to look at this again. I kind of put it to bed, and
Yeah.
I am who I am. But I guess curiosity got the better of me. And we were still living in Santa Cruz at that time, doing college ministry in a small group in church with some lovely friends, of which 3 of us were adopted.
Oh, wow.
And we were all going through the 23andMe experience at the same time.
Ah,
And they were in their probably late 60s.
okay.
I was in my early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a lot to discover. So I sent it away, got it back, looked up the results, and then it tells you on this graph, do you want to see who you're related to, who's given their sample? And it started spitting out the names of people. And the one I was closely related to in DNA was someone I looked up on Facebook. And he was friends with someone in my small group at church.
Whoa. Oh my goodness, that does give me goosebumps. That's such a small world. That's a crazy coincidence. Wink, wink.
Exactly. A God manufactured coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
So I called my friend at small group and I said, "How do you know Derek Westfall, my cousin?" And he said, "Oh my goodness, I worked for his dad's company. They are the most beautiful Christian people in the Bay Area. How do you know them?" And I said, "Well, we're related. I just found out through 23andMe." And he said, "Oh my gosh, you have to meet this family." And I said, "I'll think about it." But I had a
Oh.
little bit of hope. So now the
Mm-hmm.
running joke in this family, because these people have become like my closest friends.
Yes.
Spoiler alert. But I wrote to Derek on 23andMe and I heard nothing back for a year. And now we
Wow.
all joke around about that. Like now that I know him, I'm like, oh, of course you didn't respond.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he was probably so skeptical. So a year later, I heard back from Derek, and he said, "I think that you're more closely related to my father. You would be first cousins once removed. And so I'm going to pass on this information to my dad. Good luck," something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard from his father, whose name is Steve, within a month. It was just fantastic. And it was, a response that was many paragraphs long. I
Wow.
guess he had Googled me and saw that I do college ministry. And it kind of went like this: "Wow, we are sisters and brothers in Christ and we're related. And I can't wait to meet you. When can we come down?" And it just
Wow.
took off from there. And so he and his wife came down to Santa Cruz and went to church with us. And then we went out to lunch and just began to exchange stories. And it was the most surreal experience, Ellen. I kept kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, like something's going to be really wrong with these people, or, something's going to show
Mm-hmm.
up. But the more time
Yeah.
we spent together, the more we adored one another. And I got close to Steve and Meredith, the older couple that I'm most closely biologically related to. And
Mm-hmm.
they too were reaching out to college students,
Wow.
doing ministry in Oakland, and got really close to Derek, the one who had been so skeptical, and his wife Tara, and met their kids. And it just became this rhythm where we would start spending time together. And then we felt called to leave Santa Cruz and to move all the way down here in Carlsbad, and they're in the Bay Area. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember thinking, God, how can something so sweet be happening and I'm going to have to leave it? Will this discontinue the relationship? And I guess
Mm-hmm.
what I really learned from all of that was that distance doesn't matter, that
Hmm.
we've still become such a strong part of each other's lives, whether it be through FaceTime or emails or planning visits where they come down or I go up there, and being able to learn, the background of my life, and to
Mm-hmm.
learn I'm Dutch on both sides, but also to
Wow.
just know this lovely partnership with the Lord. And that even if I weren't biologically related to them, God gave me these people. You know what I mean? Like I would choose them as
Mm-hmm.
friends. But I have both. I have my bloodline and I have a friendship. And it's been really healing to the degree that I can talk about all that scary stuff that was living in me that had shame attached to it, or fear or sadness or grief. And I can just talk about it in a different way because it was the healing ointment, that God gave me,
Wow.
and just said, "Just give it time, Susan. I'm going to bring something wonderful to you."
Wow. That is an amazing story. I love that. Love seeing God's care for us, his provision, not always in our timing, too. He knew it was coming.
Right, right. Yeah. And, I think for me, there was something that one of my pastors taught me a while back. He was like, "Remember that in this life, we have to take the long view." meaning that we're not always going to see or experience or get the desires of our heart when we think they should be coming.
Yeah.
But we take the long view of our life going into eternity, And so we might get to taste some of the goodness here, but we won't fully eat until we're with God. And so that really helped me, just as I'm 56 years old, and God willing, I have lots of years left. When I take the long view and look back at that person who was in her 20s searching for her birth parents, it just pings of that God's going to bring it when you least expect it and when you really actually need it.
Wow. That's great. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. Any other thoughts from that you want to share?
I guess my thought would be that for anybody who's adopted, I think that there's this tendency to not feel a part of your family. There can be, it depends how your adopted family turned out, but there can be this real wonder about the birth family and what they're doing and what life would have turned out like. And that there's a loss that I really wasn't willing to dive into until all of this came up, and that it's okay to explore that. It's not mistrusting God or God's plan, that it's okay to dig into those spaces where we feel grief, where we feel unheld. And answers like, oh, but we belong to the family of God. Yes, that's true. But there can be some real dissonance about, I have such and such as blue eyes, or I have brown hair like my grandma, and growing up without any of that connection can be unsettling at times, or just wondering what was the circumstance that I wasn't kept.
Yes. Yeah,
And so
definitely.
exploring that with a therapist is really helpful. There's some really good books about that, and being able to talk to trusted friends or relatives about it, I think, is healthy too. And adoption has changed a lot over the years. It's much more openly talked about, as opposed to this was a done deal and we don't have to talk about it. To not feel like they're being disloyal to their adoptive family if they need to look in some of these spaces.
That's great. And you've referenced a couple times as we as people, or we in the church, can talk to people who are adopted, that there are some things that just are not helpful to hear or ask about. I'd love for you to share more about that. How can we be more sensitive and helpful to someone who's been adopted?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think that when someone chooses to share that they're adopted, a really good response for something like that might be, is that something that you could share? Or what has that experience been like for you? How has that shaped you as a human being? I think avoiding things like, do you know who your real family is? Especially that term, your real family. I know that every time I would hear that growing up, it would just hit my heart so hard. My real family is my real family, right? Family is whoever has raised you. So being able to say things like, have you met your birth family? But maybe give that a little bit of time. I think that that's one of those questions that if we are on an intimate basis with someone, we have the right to ask that. So
That's good.
just being curious, oh, really? That's interesting. How has that shaped you as a human being? Could be a good opener. Or is that something that you like to talk about? Or is that something that's part of your story? Just like how you kind of asked me, is a gentler way, I think, as opposed to people having to think on their feet like, ooh, how much do I want to share about this?
Right. That's good. What's really funny, Susan, is it just reminded me of a story in my own life where I had a grandmother who wasn't really my grandmother. She was my dad's first wife's mother. And so I wasn't really her grandchild, but my brother and sister were. And so we went to go visit some people, and she made the comment, "Oh, this isn't my real granddaughter. This is so and so's." And I had never ever felt from her that I wasn't her real granddaughter. And looking back on it, I think she was just trying to explain the relationship. But
Sure.
as a young kid, I didn't know that. And it just hurt for so long. And then later, I ended up, visiting her a couple of times when I was in college and just, I think, establishing that relationship, knowing that I was, firm as a granddaughter in her eyes. But yeah, I can see how, was that your real family, or just saying things like that can really hit you.
Yeah, wow, Ellen, that would be painful. That
Mhm.
sentence just hurt my heart when you said it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's that setting apart kind of like why does that have to be said, you know? And I would say that my parents kind of did the opposite. They would say things like, "Oh, you've got your father's blue eyes," or "You've got," and I would think, "Well, how is that possible? I know I'm adopted. Why are you saying this?" But I think they
Mhm.
were almost overkill in terms of inclusion and not wanting me to ever doubt their inclusion of me. But to the degree that now that we know the term gaslighting, I wasn't given permission to ask questions,
Ah.
to say, well, that's what? How could I do that? I'm adopted. That's not possible. That wouldn't have been okay for me to say.
Mhm.
And so I think that now we're taught much more about entertaining or processing questions that kids have. It's not a threatening thing. It's natural to be curious.
Yes, definitely.
It's
That's
natural
good.
to want to know who we stem from. And nowadays with biomarkers and all the stuff that you can find out on 23andMe, it was really interesting to see, oh, I'm not at risk for that. I'm not at risk for that. That's good to know. Because,
Mm.
how many times does an adopted person fill out a form in the doctor office and it says, what is your health history? And every time
Right.
you write, I don't know, I'm adopted. you
Yes.
know? Yeah.
Another thing you said, Susan, which I so appreciated, was maybe another believer just making the comment, oh, we're all part of God's family, and using more platitudes than real questions or statements that are more sensitive. And I think sometimes perhaps we do that because we feel awkward, or we think, oh, this will make the person feel better, or we think, oh, this will make me feel better. So can you comment on that? That's just been something that I feel really strongly about, is not just giving these pat answers from the Bible, because to me that does the Bible a disservice, really.
Well, yeah, thanks for saying that. I couldn't agree more. I feel like there's so many instances where it's just best to keep our mouth shut. And I think you're right. It comes out of discomfort for people, either themselves, they don't know what to say, they've been modeled that, you know.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And just to be able to say real things like, especially in the grief realm, like when there's been a death, the whole heaven's gained a new angel. Oh, I just,
Mm,
all of the things that can be said. But to merely say, wow, that must have been really hard, or that must be really painful, or I wonder if that was ever confusing, or how was that for you? Just to not make assumptions about things and let people have their own process. You could ask the question, how was that for you spiritually?
sure.
Because there's a
Yeah.
lot of abandonment issues in people who are adopted. And, there can be this way that we project how we see our heavenly father based on our earthly father, right?
Hmm.
And if there is something messy there, as there was in my life with my birth dad and then my dad who raised me, oh, a heavenly father, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So, how did that affect me spiritually was something I had to really unwind and create a whole new persona of maybe the ideal father. And that's who God is. And for a long time, I couldn't really think of our Father who art in heaven. That was just, oof, that was kind of creepy. But I could think about
Mm,
Jesus. And given that they're the triune God, that's okay. I could think
yeah.
about that. Jesus is my Father. And that more
Hmm.
loving, graceful, embracing, guiding, shepherding God.
That's great. Do you have any other pointers to people who have been adopted? You've already mentioned a couple of great ones, One would be that it's okay to look into your past and you're not necessarily betraying your adopted parents.
Yeah, I do. I think if you make the decision to open Pandora's box, be prepared to hear and see things that could be shocking or upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about managing expectations. I remember watching the show This Is Us. It is so good because it deals with so many psychological issues. And one of the characters is adopted. And I remember him talking about his ghost family. And how they showed it is they showed the little self of him watching his parents in the kitchen, but then he'd kind of split, like go off in his mind and imagine his birth parents and this whole other life going on. And then he would kind of return back to his body and be present, and he'd have all this shame about wondering, but then also wondering, who am I and where did I come from? So I'm sitting on the couch watching this. I can remember like it was yesterday. I have chills right now. And my husband was next to me and I just started sobbing.
Oh.
And I said, I didn't know there was a name for that. And I didn't know that other people thought this. You know, they did their research really well on that show. So I think that it opens up stuff in us that we don't know exists. So it's good to have someone walk through that with you, a therapist or a life coach, a really trusted friend who's a good communicator, a spouse, but especially a professional who has a little bit of expertise in it, because we just don't know what's around the corner when we get those answers.
That's great.
Yeah.
Good advice.
And certainly my
Thank you.
answers were complicated. You know, some of the things that I found out about abuse and suicide, and they were really hard to take in. You know, I already had a hard family that I was raised with, and then I had this sort of layered on top of it, and it was a lot to process. So again, meeting Tara, Derek, Steve, and Meredith, my Westfall cousins. Nobody's perfect, but they're pretty close. They're so kind and they love so well and they love Jesus. Like, it was just such a gift at such the right time, because all this other pain and wrestling had been going on for so many years.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And before we sign off, is there anything you'd like to share that you're learning about these days? Or you also mentioned that you've written some books, so I'd love to put links to that as well.
Thank you.
On the show notes.
Thanks. I mean, right now, you know, I'm just really enjoying my life, to be perfectly honest. I feel like I'm in this really sweet spot where I'm allowed to slow down a little bit. I'm a little more reflective. I'm trying to really practice the disciplines of silence and solitude and saying no. That's not to say I'm not incredibly busy. I am busy, but I carve out space where I'm not busy and where I can be by myself. I kind of like to be by myself. I'm an only child and I need that time. And so it just feels like a different season for me, and just a sweet time with the Lord, where every day it feels like I look forward to getting up and hearing, what do I have to learn today and how do I need to humble myself? What needs a touch of grace so that I can be more available to others? So it feels like a sweet season.
Wow.
Yeah. And, you know, I have written a couple of books. I wrote a psychological fiction book when I was burning out as a therapist. That's actually how I left the field. Luckily, my supervisor spotted it in me and said, do you need to take some time off? You know? And I said, I really do. I think I might want to transition to being a writer. And she gave me 4 weeks to make that decision, which was beautiful. And then wrote that novel, and then wrote a nonfiction book. So my first book was called Out of Breath. My first book that I wrote is not rated G.
Okay.
Adult content. I don't know. You know, it covers a lot of stuff, and there's a point to it, but it definitely is a story of reconciliation and how God can bless people even through horrible tragedy. If it's about some addiction and a child loss, you know.
Okay.
Yeah. So adult themes.
Good way to put it.
Yeah. The second book was called Grief Inc., and that was about people who get memorial tattoos.
Wow. Yes. You showed me that. That's phenomenal.
And it was a beautiful experience of being able to walk into strangers' lives who just opened up their hearts and souls and told me their deepest pains, and we got to photograph it. And it was really an honor. And I have a third book that I've written. I keep saying I'm going to work on a revision, and it hasn't happened yet, but it's very biographical about my adoption story. And when I wrote it, I hadn't met the Westfalls yet.
Wow.
And so that's the revision, is that it's going to have this beautiful surprise. I was still sort of in the pain when I was writing it. And so I didn't want to return to it. But now that they've been in my life for some time, I feel like I have the stamina and the wherewithal to revisit dark places with this light at the end of the tunnel,
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much, Susan. I so appreciate you and how you do reach out to others and your impact in the community and in so many lives. So thank you to you and John. And thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Ellen. It was a joy.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. This is Ellen Bennett with the Extraordinary Lives podcast.